Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Raya and I'm the daughter.
And I'm Joe, and I'm the dad.
Dad, I had a great idea to start telling jokes where the punchlines would be the song titles of Journey songs.
The
Right? You
song
remember?
titles of Journey songs?
Yeah, like the band Journey. When I started telling them, they said my jokes were so stupid and it just made me cry. Well, who's crying now? I recently finished reading through the book called How Minds Change: The Surprising Science of Belief, Opinion, and Persuasion by David McRaney. Great book. I highly, highly recommend it. He tells the story of how they learned to do something called deep canvassing. When they were trying to convince people to change their minds on LGBTQ issues, they sent a group of people out and they discovered if instead of confronting people with facts and trying to give them a bunch of information, they started by building rapport and then asking the people to tell their own stories, they had a dramatic change in people's attitudes. Most surprising of all is that when you asked the people if they thought that they had changed, they generally felt like, no, I've always believed about like I have. But when they looked at and polled the people who had these discussions compared to the people that didn't have the discussions, there was a huge increase in the number of people that were supporters versus the exact same control group that were not supporters. So while minds were actually being changed through building rapport and asking people to tell their stories and then coming back with people telling their own stories, the people whose minds were being changed didn't realize that they were changing at all. They just figured, I'm having a conversation and I'm just drawing out what I already believe. Boy, that building rapport and taking the time to listen to people and hearing them tell their stories is so important if we're going to help people to change their minds.
That brings us to the topic of the week here. Often, if we're going to be sitting down with somebody who is objecting to the LGBTQ plus society in any form, it becomes a conversation that's more of a debate. The people who are objecting are throwing out objections, putting those of us who are either being LGBTQ plus or being an affirming ally. The difference is that we are always put on the defensive. They say, but what about, or why do you do this, or something else? That's usually the conversation. So you're sitting down with a mother or a dad or a grandchild or anyone else who is not affirming. You will discover that they start out with questions like being non binary is just a trend or something like that. They throw those things out, expecting us to defend that. This particular podcast is about to give you a secret to change that entire conversation. When you have a conversation like that, it can sometimes accelerate and get really blown out of proportion. But when you are approached by someone who says something that in itself could be an hour or 2 hour long conversation, when they throw out anything at all that isn't logical or it's something that they're repeating because somebody else said it, the secret question you come back with in some form or other would be something like, what do you mean by that? Now, that is a game changer. When you say, what do you mean by that? In a conversation with non allies, it's a subtle shift in dynamics. And the discussion can change in several key ways just because you stop it right there. Suddenly, the shift changes from you being the person who is on the defense to having them be the people that have to explain what they're saying first. What do you mean by that? We want to go through that in more detail.
That's right. For one thing, it encourages clarity and accountability. Because so often somebody that's a non-ally or a skeptic towards LGBTQ issues is going to just be repeating assumptions or stereotypes or vague criticisms without really thinking through what it means. So when you stop and you ask questions, instead of you feeling like I need to answer all of these things, you instead come back, what do you mean by that? Tell me a little bit about your assumptions. You ask them to unpack it. What you're doing is you're prompting them to articulate their thoughts more clearly, which can then reveal flaws or inconsistencies in their own reasoning. So they come out and they say, well, you know how gay and lesbian people are just more unhappy in their relationships. Really? What do you mean by that? Well, I mean that they're less satisfied in life. Really? Where do you hear that? Where's that information coming from? Less satisfied how? How do you mean by that? What you oftentimes will find is that as you just ask them to explain, they discover, well, maybe I don't really know as much about this as I thought that I did.
What it does is it immediately puts the ball in their court. You now are not on the defensive. They're there, and instead of immediately reacting, this question focuses on the other person to explain their statement, which they may or may not fully have thought through. Many LGBTQ comments are based on assumptions or they're repeating other things that they've heard. And when they're asked to clarify, people often realize their logic is weak or maybe oversimplified. Sometimes they don't really have an understanding of what they were really talking about. Raya, you recently mentioned to me that you were speaking with one of your children, and he said, I kind of missed the opportunity to have a dad that does the dad things. And your response was something about, I thought I did a lot of those things with you. What are you referring to? And what was his answer? You never taught me how to shave. That was
Yep.
it. He thought he lost his dad because he didn't do dad things with him, and then he realized he couldn't think of anything except you never taught him how to shave.
And this is actually many, many years ago. And actually, then I did say, I actually still have to shave just because I'm transgender and on hormones now did not make my facial hair go away. And in fact, I have paid a lot of money to try to burn away follicle by follicle, electrocute them actually away those hair follicles on my face. And I still have a lot of those. I still have to shave, not necessarily every day, but quite a bit. So I said,
Uh-huh.
hey, I can actually show you that right now. Let me show you how to shave. And then we did. It was actually really a good moment there.
But that's another example. People will say, oh, well, this is so much different. Well, what do you mean by that? And then they suddenly think, well, I guess I can't really think of anything. Oh, wait, there was that one little thing. And it's suddenly what they think is separating you isn't at all.
Another thing it does is it shifts the burden of explanation. So often we feel like we're put on the defensive. We're in this conversation with somebody that we love and they were watching something on the news or they heard some talking head that made some point about LGBTQ people and then they want to come guns blazing and we feel like we're put on the defensive. So we stop and we ask, what do you mean by that? And we ask them, and no, this has to be done in good faith. That is really important here, is because if we start saying, well, what do you mean by that? Okay, well, that's going to get the person's guard up. But I think of a lot of these conversations, somebody has built up their ideas in their mind, and it's a little bit like a Jenga tower that it can very easily topple over. So if you come in and you try to test it and push it and this thing and that thing, what are they going to do? They're going to defend themselves. When they come in, they're trying to do really the same thing. Well, what do you think about this? And what about that? And, I heard this person say such and such. When we stop trying to defend ourselves and instead come back with that question, what do you mean by that? Tell me a little bit about what you think that means. Now, we're putting them in a position where they're having to test their own Jenga tower. And when we do that in a way that we show, look, I'm not out to get you. I'm not out to try to earn points against you and make you feel lousy. I'm here because I want us to have a good relationship together. Would you answer a few of my questions about how you came to your position right there? Then they can come and test their own Jenga tower and realize, this thing is really not as solid as I thought it was going to be. It shifts the burden. When you ask them, sometimes they will find themselves coming to a place where they say, "Oh, I guess I didn't really think this through like I thought that I did."
Another thing it does, it slows the conversation down. So you're in a conversation with somebody, say a mother, a dad, a neighbor, a friend, a non ally. You're in a conversation in any way. Sometimes those discussions can become emotionally charged. When you ask this question, it creates a pause. It gives both of you a moment to breathe and to think and possibly to de escalate the tensions before the conversation gets out of hand. That just makes so much sense that we come back to common sense discussions rather than these escalated discussions. When you slow down the conversation, it prevents a knee jerk reaction and invites a more thoughtful discussion. De escalate tense moments and move away from confrontation and going back to good common sense dialogue. This is another powerful tool that one question can help de escalate the tension and the conversation.
There's actually a lot of different tools that you can use. This is just one tool among many, but they always say that slowing down conversations can be really important. Like sometimes they'll say, if you get really heated, take a moment, take a deep breath, have both of you take a deep breath. Just that act of slowing down the conversation can help you remember that it's about the relationship and it's not about trying to win points. It's about building your love for one another.
I'm Chuck Reynolds, and I started listening to Transcendent because Joe is my friend. I keep listening because I have friends, colleagues, and family members who are part of the LGBTQ community, and I want to better understand their struggles and perspectives. I have become a supporter because I believe Joe and Raya are truly helping to preserve relationships and save lives. Join me in supporting Transcendent. Just go to transcendent.com, click on support, and select the amount you'd like to give each month. It can be as little as $3, and you can cancel at any time.
What else can you do by introducing a question like, what do you mean by that, Raya?
Not only does it slow down the conversation, it also reveals underlying assumptions. So when your skeptic loved one says something like, I just think being LGBTQ plus is a choice. You can ask them, well, what do you mean by that? And then they have to think through, well, what do they mean? A choice how? You mean you think that I was sitting around one day and I thought, what would be really fun is it would be great if I completely changed my gender presentation and had everybody in my life judge me and my entire life fall apart and everything, people look at me weird and boy, that would be really wonderful. Is that what you mean? Well, it only takes a little bit of trying to, unpack that till you realize those assumptions really don't make a lot of sense at all. Or, somebody says, I just feel like that's not natural. Well, tell me what you mean by not natural. How do you define natural? Give me a few of those assumptions that you're talking about, and let's see if that holds up because then you can ask them, how do you feel about somebody that is born with a cleft palate? Doctors come in and operate on that. Do you feel like that's the same thing or is that different? And how is that different? You don't have to tell them, you don't have to give them facts. You're just asking, what do you mean by that? And by that, do you mean that it would also apply over here? Or, you can have them test those assumptions, ask them a few questions about it, and that can help you to get to a place of underlying agreement rather than the disagreement.
What it does is it helps uncover the real issue that they have, which can then be addressed a lot more effectively. So when they realize that what they're thinking might be based on misinformation, fear, or bias, that helps them to explain what they really think and gives you the opportunity to present facts or context or a different perspective, which makes it so much easier for both of you to begin to find common ground. We talk about that so much on this podcast, the common ground. And this question, this golden question, will help you to reach some of that common ground. It's really great to be able to do that. The other thing I will do, it will allow you to filter out bad faith arguments. Some non-allies might just want to provoke you, or they want to insult you or something like that. And if they struggle to explain what they mean, it might indicate they're speaking from bias rather than genuine belief. It makes it easier for you to decide if engaging any further with them is worthwhile. It's another plus of coming out with that powerful question.
This question can also be used in a scenario where somebody tells a joke that they think you're going to laugh at, but is making fun of LGBTQ plus people or of any other marginalized minority. What do you mean by that? Or the way that I like to say this one is, I don't get it. Why is that funny? Can you explain that to me? And when a joke is based on using somebody, another person, as the punchline, you can discover that just taking that moment of not laughing at it and saying, what do you mean by that? Why is that funny? When they have to explain it, then they realize, well, it's funny because I don't like gay people very much. Or it's funny because I am trying to marginalize transgender people. They're not going to say that. But as soon as you ask them to unpack, why is the joke funny? And they have to explain it, they realize that was actually really pretty mean. That was not something that is honoring towards other people. What do you mean by that? Can be a great way to diffuse that tension and gently let things down without having to have the other person lose face or, needing to humiliate them. You just ask them to explain themselves and then they can come to their own conclusion. Now, does that always work? No, but you can diffuse that tense situation by making things a little bit easier.
The last big benefit, and I shouldn't say the last one we want to address, there might be other benefits from this as well. But when you get to what do you mean by that, it gives you more control over the conversation. That's a real key. Instead of defending yourself or feeling put out on the spot, you become the one guiding the discussion. By making the other person do the explaining, you avoid getting emotionally drained, but you're also keeping them accountable for their words. So that's really a great way to keep a conversation level, keep a conversation flowing, and keep a conversation fair so that one isn't always on the defensive and the other one is always on the attack. Just that golden sentence, what do you mean by that, can make a big difference in a conversation that otherwise could go south pretty quickly. So the question is a conversational mirror. It makes people reflect on what they're really saying. Whether it leads to a productive discussion or reveals someone's unwillingness to engage, honestly, it gives you more power in the conversation. Power that allows you to explain yourself in a way that doesn't have to be defensive, but you can often walk away from a discussion like this feeling as though maybe you haven't changed somebody else's mind, but you've diffused what might otherwise become an argument. And you've walked away having both of you think a little bit more logically about the conversation you've had and the fact that you have probably reached some common ground you never thought you'd meet in that conversation. It is a great tool and one that I'm sure that if you remember just those words, it'll make your conversation a lot better and it will help to keep you and your family together. And that's one of the things we're about here is keeping families together.
That's right. Otherwise, you don't want to go your separate ways. You want to instead approach them with open arms. And that brings me back to our journey song titles. You want to approach them faithfully. People ask, how do we have this conversation? Any way you want it. Just don't stop believing. But one thing that will never stop believing is this podcast. We're grateful to have you coming back here week after week as we give you some tools and some tips that you can use to make your relationship stronger and better. And remember what really matters, our relationships and the people that we love.
Well, that journey thing was pretty cute, but what do you mean by that, Raya? I think you mean with that, we'll see you Monday.